few months ago, my girlfriend Sarah and I decided to take a short vacation. Work had been suffocating us. Endless meetings, tight deadlines, and the overall grind of city life wore us down. We thought a weekend away would be perfect to unwind and reconnect. Rather than booking a sterile hotel room, Sarah found a charming Airbnb, a secluded cabin in the mountains that promised peace and quiet. It seemed like the ideal escape from the city's constant noise and busyness. The listing boasted stunning views, cozy interiors, and the kind of rustic charm that drew us in immediately. It had great reviews, too. Everyone raved about how inviting and serene the cabin was, how accommodating the host Marie had been, and how the place had the perfect energy. However, there was one thing that struck me as odd. All of the reviews were from last year. There hadn't been a single new review in months. But with the excitement of the getaway looming, I brushed it aside. Marie, the host, messaged us promptly after we booked, providing directions, local tips about the area, and a friendly reminder that there was no cell service up there. The lack of signal felt inconvenient at first, but we figured a few days disconnected from the world would be refreshing. No emails, no notifications, just the two of us in nature. We left on a Friday afternoon, the drive taking about 4 hours. The further we got from civilization, the more excited Sarah became. She loved the idea of getting lost in nature, the allure of the mountains calling her. I was a bit more skeptical, but her enthusiasm was infectious. The winding roads grew narrower, the trees thicker, and eventually we turned onto an old dirt path that led us deep into the woods. The cabin itself was picturesque, small but perfect for 2 people. It sat at the end of a narrow trail, surrounded by dense trees on all sides, the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves creating a natural symphony. When we arrived, the air was crisp and clean, filling our lungs with freshness I hadn't felt in years. For a moment, I forgot about the odd lack of recent reviews and let myself relax. Marie had left the door unlocked for us. When we stepped inside, it was everything the pictures had promised. Rustic wooden furniture, a stone fireplace, and large windows that gave a panoramic view of the forest. A small kitchen was tucked away in one corner, and above it, a loft area featured another bed. It was quaint and comfortable, just what we'd hoped for. "Look at this place, it's perfect," Sarah exclaimed, spinning around to take it all in. "I have to admit it does look nice," I replied, forcing a smile. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I pushed it aside for the sake of our trip. As the sun began to set, we unpacked our bags and made ourselves at home. Sarah immediately fell in love with the place, bustling about, arranging our things, while I took a moment to explore. I noticed the cabin was well maintained, but there was an unsettling stillness that hung in the air. It felt heavy, like something lingered just out of sight. After a while, we settled down by the fire, sharing a bottle of wine and laughing over old memories. It was the first time in a long while we had uninterrupted time together, and I found myself relaxing despite the strange atmosphere. The evening passed blissfully, but as night fell, the chill began to seep into the cabin. Even with the fire roaring, I could feel an icy tendril wrapping around my spine. "We should probably turn in," Sarah suggested, yawning and snuggling into her blanket. I agreed, and we headed to bed, the warmth of the fire lingering in the air. Lying in bed trying to drift off to sleep, I heard it, footsteps. They were faint but distinct, coming from above us. At first, I thought it was just the cabin settling, the old wooden floors creaking as they often do. But then the footsteps came again, heavier this time, like someone or something was walking around in the loft. I froze. I hadn't checked the loft before, but it was such a small space that it didn't seem like anyone could hide up there. Besides, we were in the middle of nowhere. No one should have been inside the cabin but us. "Sarah," I whispered, nudging her, "do you hear that?" She stirred, groggily opening her eyes. "What?" "Listen." For a moment, there was silence. Then, as if on cue, the footsteps started again, pacing back and forth directly above us. Her eyes widened. "Is someone up there?" "I don't know." I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table, the only weapon-like object he could find, and motioned for her to stay in bed. Slowly, I made my way toward the stairs leading up to the loft. Each step felt like it echoed through the cabin, the air around me growing colder with every inch I climbed. When I reached the top, I shone the flashlight into the small space. The loft was completely empty. No person, no animals, nothing that could explain the sounds we'd heard. But then, just as I turned to go back down, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There were indentations in the dust on the floor, footprints, bare, human-like footprints leading from one end of the loft to the other. I had no idea how they could have gotten there. The dust was thick, undisturbed except for those prints. I hurried back downstairs, my heart racing, and told Sarah what I saw. She didn't know what to make of it either, but she insisted we should try to get some sleep, claiming it was probably just my imagination. I wanted to argue, but I was too rattled to think straight. We managed a few restless hours before morning came, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that we weren't alone in the cabin. The next day, we tried to shake off our nerves and enjoy the outdoors. We hiked a nearby trail and spent some time by the lake, but the strange atmosphere of the cabin lingered in the back of my mind. I kept glancing back toward the cabin as if I half expected to see a figure watching us from the window. Sarah was more carefree, laughing and splashing in the water, but I couldn't relax. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we returned to the cabin, ready to settle in for another night. We were cooking dinner when the lights flickered, plunging the cabin into darkness for a brief moment. My heart raced again, but Sarah laughed it off. Maybe the power's a little shaky out here. It's an old place. Yeah, or maybe it's haunted, I said jokingly, trying to lighten the mood, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling in my stomach. After dinner, we sat by the fire, talking and sharing stories. The cozy warmth of the flames wrapped around us, providing a comforting contrast to the coldness creeping into the corners of the cabin. But then, just as we were starting to feel relaxed, we both heard it, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. Slowly, cautiously, I stood up and looked toward the front door. It was wide open, swaying gently on its hinges. My heart raced as I realized I had locked it before we sat down for the evening. "What the hell?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, the night air biting at my skin. The world was silent, the only sound being the distant rustling of leaves. I quickly shut the door and locked it, glancing around to ensure no one was lurking in the shadows. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, concern etched on her face. "Yeah, I don't know. Let's just stay inside," I replied, trying to reassure both of us. We spent the next few hours trying to distract ourselves with movies and snacks, but the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thick, oppressive, like a storm was brewing just out of sight. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Later, when we finally decided to turn in, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, more insistent, and they weren't just confined to the loft. It sounded like someone was walking right outside our bedroom door, pacing up and down the hallway. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. "What is it?" "I don't know," I admitted, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Sarah clutched my arm, her face pale. "Should we get out of here?" "Not yet," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let me check." I took a deep breath and crept toward the door. With a trembling hand, I turned the knob and opened it slowly, the creaking sound echoing through the cabin. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the flickering flames of the fireplace in the living room. Just as I stepped outside the room, there was a loud bang, a crash from the kitchen. Something had fallen, maybe broken. The sound echoed through the cabin, followed by complete, deafening silence. "James?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. "Stay here," I shouted back, trying to keep my fear at bay as I walked cautiously toward the kitchen. Each step felt like it echoed through the cabin, the air growing colder around me. When I reached the kitchen, the sight made my blood run cold. The table was overturned, chairs scattered, and the cabinets stood open, their contents spilled across the floor. "What the hell happened?" I muttered under my breath, scanning the room for any signs of a break-in or an explanation. But there was nothing. It looked as if a tornado had swept through, but how? I heard Sarah's footsteps behind me and I turned. "You should have stayed in the bedroom, I told you to." Before I could finish, the lights flickered again, plunging the cabin into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight, my fingers trembling as I turned it on. "Sarah?" I called, but she didn't answer. I shone the flashlight around the room, panic setting in. "Sarah!" I yelled again, my voice echoing through the silence. Then, from behind me, I heard a soft whisper. "James." It sent chills racing down my spine. The voice sounded like Sarah's, but it was distant, distorted. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the hallway, but there was no one there. Sarah? James! The voice came again, but it was different now, closer, more frantic. I rushed back into the hallway, the light beam flickering over the floorboards as I called for her. Where are you? There was no response. Just then I heard a soft thud from the loft. I hesitated, dread pooling in my stomach. Sarah! I shouted, darting up the stairs, the flashlight illuminating the space. When I reached the top, my heart dropped. The loft was empty, but on the floor the footprints had multiplied. They led to the window, where the glass was slightly ajar, moving gently with the wind. I rushed back downstairs, desperate to find Sarah. I'm coming, just hold on. As I reached the bottom, I saw the living room was dimly lit by the fire. Sarah was there, standing frozen in front of the fireplace, her back to me. I felt a surge of relief. Thank God. What are you doing? But she didn't respond. Sarah? I stepped closer, the flashlight beam hitting her face, and my heart dropped again. Her expression was vacant, her eyes glassy and unfocused, as if she were staring at something far beyond me. Sarah, are you okay? I asked, reaching out to touch her shoulder. Suddenly she turned toward me, and I recoiled in horror. Her face twisted in confusion and fear, lips moving as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came out. Then I saw it, a shadow moving behind her, creeping along the walls, dark and unnatural. The lights flickered again, and in that split second I caught a glimpse of something horrifying. An elongated figure, featureless, standing just behind Sarah. Get away from her, I screamed, lunging forward, but as I did, the shadow vanished into the darkness, leaving only Sarah standing there, oblivious to everything. Sarah, please, I shouted again, shaking her. You have to snap out of it. Slowly her eyes focused on me, and I could see recognition wash over her face. James, what happened? I felt a wave of relief flood through me. Thank God, we need to get out of here. No, wait, she said, still looking disoriented. What about the fire? Forget the fire. We have to leave now, I insisted, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the door. Just as we reached the threshold, the temperature dropped suddenly, and the door slammed shut in front of us. I pushed against it, panic clawing at my throat. Let us out, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. In the silence that followed, I could hear the footsteps again, louder this time, circling us, taunting us. The atmosphere thickened, darkness closing in like a vice around us. James, what's happening? Sarah cried, pressing against me. I don't know, I shouted, heart racing as I scanned the room, looking for an escape. We have to find another way. Suddenly, a loud crash erupted from the loft, and the staircase began to shake violently. My heart sank. Whatever was up there, it was coming for us. Run, I shouted, dragging Sarah back toward the kitchen. We sprinted through the darkened room, our breath heavy in the air. I could feel the shadow lingering behind us, pressing in on us like a predator closing in on its prey. As we reached the kitchen, I spotted the back door half open, the moonlight spilling in like a beacon of hope. Over there, I yelled, pulling Sarah with me. But just as we reached it, the door slammed shut with a deafening thud, locking us inside again. I screamed in frustration, banging against it as panic rose in my throat. James, Sarah shouted, her voice filled with terror. And then I saw it. The elongated figure reappeared in the darkness of the kitchen. It loomed tall and menacing, its shape flickering like a flame. The air turned frigid, and I could feel an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. Get away, I yelled, turning to shield Sarah. We won't let you take her. The figure paused, the silence stretching for an eternity. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, adrenaline coursing through my veins. And then just as suddenly, it lunged forward, an unnatural scream piercing through the night. I pushed Sarah behind me, instinctively stepping forward to protect her. But just as it reached us, everything went dark. I felt a sudden rush of wind, and in an instant, I was standing outside the cabin, the moon shining brightly overhead. I turned, heart racing, searching for Sarah. Sarah, I yelled, panic surging through me as I scanned the area, but she was nowhere to be found. The cabin loomed behind me, ominous and still, the door hanging open. I stepped back, hesitant, knowing that whatever had happened inside was far from over. Sarah, I shouted again, fear gripping me tightly. Then, in the distance, I heard her voice. James, help! It echoed through the night, a desperate cry. I turned and ran toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. Where are you? I yelled, adrenaline pushing me forward. The voice grew louder, pulling me deeper into the woods. I sprinted through the trees, the branches scratching at my arms as I tore through the darkness, desperate to find her. Finally, I broke into a small clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. In the center stood an ancient tree, twisted and gnarled. At its base lay Sarah, unconscious, her face pale and lifeless. I rushed to her side, fear clawing at my throat. "Sarah," I shook her, panic rising. "Wake up, please." But she didn't stir. As I held her, I felt a chill creeping over me, a sense of foreboding that something was watching us. I glanced around, heart racing, feeling the air grow thick with unease. Then, from the shadows, the figure emerged again. It loomed over us, its presence suffocating, eyes hollow and devoid of light. "Leave her alone," I screamed, instinctively positioning myself between the figure and Sarah, desperate to protect her. But the figure didn't move, standing there silently as if studying me. The air grew colder still, and I could feel my strength fading, fear washing over me like a tidal wave. And then I heard it, a low whisper, soft and haunting, echoing through the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here. Why are you doing this?" he shouted, my voice breaking. "What do you want?" "Her," it hissed, the sound slithering into my ears like poison. "She belongs to us." Panic surged through me as I realized what it meant. "No, she's not yours." With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I grabbed Sarah and hoisted her on my shoulder, stumbling away from the tree as fast as I could. The figure followed, its presence looming closer, shadows stretching out like fingers to grab hold of us. "Keep going," I shouted to myself, pushing through the pain and fear, determination coursing through me. Finally, I broke through the trees and stumbled onto the dirt path leading back to the cabin. I ran, every muscle in my body screaming in protest, heart racing as I clutched Sarah tightly. The cabin loomed in the distance, its dark windows like empty eyes watching us. I could feel the figure close behind, its whispers echoing in my ears, drowning out everything else. "Don't look back, don't look back," I kept telling myself as I dashed toward the door. Just as I reached it, the door swung open, and I hurried inside, slamming it shut behind us. I locked it tight, panting heavily as I leaned against the door, my heart racing. "James?" Sarah mumbled, finally stirring. "What happened?" I knelt beside her, relief flooding my veins. "You're okay. Thank God you're okay." But just as I took a breath, I heard the whispering again, stronger this time, echoing through the cabin. "They're coming for you. They won't let you go." I felt the fear seep back in, cold and dark. I looked around, desperate to find a way out of this nightmare. "We need to barricade the door," I said, scrambling to move the table in front of it. Sarah sat up, her eyes wide with confusion. "What are you talking about? Who's coming?" I could barely focus, the darkness pressing against my mind. "The thing that was in here earlier, it wants you. We need to protect ourselves." As I pushed the table against the door, I felt the temperature drop, a frigid breath creeping into the cabin. I turned to Sarah, who was now fully alert, eyes wide and terrified. "James, what's happening?" I didn't know how to explain it. All I could do was grab her hand and pull her toward the fireplace. "We need to stay near the fire. It will keep us warm and might hold whatever that is at bay." We crouched together, clutching each other as the whispers grew louder, filling the air with dread. "James," Sarah whimpered, clutching my arm tightly. "I'm scared." "I know," I replied, my voice steady despite the panic surging within me. "Just stay close." The shadows shifted in the corners, elongating and contorting as if they were alive, creeping closer. The whispers became a cacophony, echoing around us. I could feel my breath quickening, the air growing thick and suffocating. "They want you, Sarah," I said, desperation leaking into my voice. "We can't let them have you." And then, in a chilling moment of realization, I felt something change in the air. The whispers turned into laughter, mocking and cruel, echoing around us like a twisted symphony. "No!" I screamed, shielding Sarah with my body as the shadows converged on us, darkness enveloping the room. "Let her go," I shouted, my voice breaking. But the shadows didn't listen. They surged forward, pulling at Sarah, dragging her away from me. I lunged forward, but it was like running into a wall of ice, an unyielding force that pushed me back. "James," she screamed, reaching out for me as the shadows pulled her into the darkness. "No," I roared, fighting against the unseen force, desperately trying to grasp her hand. But the shadows were relentless, swallowing her whole. I felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness wash over me, a dread that sunk deep into my bones. "Sarah," I screamed, but my voice was drowned out by the laughter. The shadows pulled her further into the depths of the cabin, and I could feel myself giving in to despair. But just as I was about to lose hope, a flicker of determination surged within me. I wouldn't let them take her without a fight. With a surge of adrenaline, I charged into the darkness, pushing against the force that sought to tear us apart. I reached for the shadows, determined to reclaim what they had stolen. "Get away from her," I bellowed, my voice cutting through the laughter. And for a moment, everything stopped. The shadows hesitated, and I felt a flicker of light in the darkness. I fought against the force, clawing my way through the murky depths, determined to reach Sarah. "Hold on," I cried, my heart pounding as I finally broke through the shadows, reaching out to her. Her eyes were wide with fear, and I could feel her desperation. I grabbed her wrist, pulling with everything I had. "James," she cried, the shadows swirling around us. "I won't let you go," I shouted, pulling her closer. With a final desperate tug, I managed to pull her free from the shadows, both of us tumbling to the ground as the darkness receded. We gasped for breath, lying on the floor of the cabin as the whispers faded into silence. The shadows retreated, leaving us alone in the dim light of the fire. "James," Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "What just happened?" "I don't know," I said, feeling the weight of everything settle around us. "But we need to get out of here. Now." Together, we scrambled to our feet, adrenaline still coursing through our veins. I pulled Sarah toward the door, heart racing as we rushed back into the night. The moon hung high in the sky, illuminating the path ahead. "We're going to be okay," I told her, trying to sound brave even though I was trembling inside. But as we stepped into the darkness, I felt it again, the shadows lurking just beyond the reach of the light, waiting for another chance to strike. And I knew this fight was far from over. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision to book the Airbnb. I had been traveling for days, jumping from one city to another, and my body begged for rest. You know that feeling, when everything aches, and even the idea of finding a hotel feels too exhausting. I needed something off the beaten path, a quiet, secluded place far from the tourist traps and noise. I wanted silence, nature, and just a little break from people. I scrolled through listings, my eyes heavy, about ready to settle for a standard hotel room, when something caught my attention. A cabin, secluded deep in the woods, marketed as a peaceful escape from the modern world. The photos were incredible. Tall trees surrounded the small cabin, with ivy creeping up its wooden walls and a wraparound porch that overlooked the forest. The place practically screamed solitude, and better yet, the price was a steal. Dirt cheap, really, considering the views. I clicked on the owner's profile, a man named Greg, who seemed to have great reviews. Everyone raved about how peaceful the stay was, how perfect the location was for disconnecting. Some mentioned that it felt almost too quiet, but I figured that's exactly what I needed, silence. A few clicks, a confirmation email, and it was set. I would stay there for a couple of nights, recharge, and then head back on the road. The drive out to the cabin was a bit longer than I expected. The directions Greg had emailed me were straightforward, but the GPS cut out about an hour before I reached the location. The signal dropped to nothing, and I found myself relying on the old-fashioned method of following printed directions. The main road turned into a gravel path that seemed to wind deeper and deeper into the woods. Towering trees lined either side of the road, their thick branches weaving into a canopy overhead, casting deep shadows even in the late afternoon. I finally reached the cabin just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The place was just as beautiful as the pictures had shown, maybe even more so in person. The cabin looked quaint and welcoming, with ivy crawling up its weathered wooden walls. A small, well-maintained garden sat near the porch, which had a couple of rocking chairs overlooking the woods. The air was crisp, and the forest around me was still, almost unnaturally still. No birds, no insects, no rustling of leaves. Just silence, exactly what I thought I wanted. Greg was waiting for me by the front steps, smiling warmly as I parked my car. He was older than I expected, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s, with a thick, graying beard and sun-weathered skin. He wore a flannel shirt and work jeans, looking every bit the part of a rustic cabin owner. "Welcome. Glad you found the place okay," he said, his voice friendly but tinged with that slow drawl of someone used to solitude. "Yeah, it was a bit tricky once the GPS cut out, but your directions were spot on," I replied, stepping out of the car and shaking his hand. "I always tell people not to rely on the technology out here. This place is a bit off the grid, which is part of its charm," Greg said, nodding toward the cabin. "No cell service, no distractions. Just you and nature. It sounded perfect. I couldn't wait to unwind after the long drive, so I grabbed my bag and Greg handed me the keys. Before he left, he gave me a quick rundown of the basics, how to light the fire, where the extra blankets were, and how to operate the old-fashioned gas stove in the kitchen. Oh, and one more thing, he added, his tone shifting slightly. This place is old, so the walls might creak at night, and you'll hear the wind howling through the trees. Nothing to worry about, just the usual cabin noises. I nodded, not thinking much of it at the time. I'd stayed in enough old places to know they had their quirks. Greg waved goodbye, hopped in his truck and drove off, leaving me alone in the cabin's quiet embrace. After unpacking, I stepped out onto the porch to take in the surroundings. The trees were massive, their trunks thick and gnarled, stretching up into the darkening sky. The air had that damp, earthy smell of the forest, mixed with the faint scent of pine. As I sat in one of the rocking chairs, I noticed how unnervingly still everything was. There wasn't a single sound, no chirping of crickets, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, just dead silence. I shook it off, reminding myself that this was why I came here. Complete isolation. No noise, no distractions. I walked around the cabin's perimeter, checking out the area as the last bit of daylight faded. There wasn't much to see beyond the thick wall of trees that surrounded the property, but something about the way the forest seemed to close in felt oppressive. The shadows grew longer, and the trees themselves almost seemed to twist and contort, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. It was getting late, so I headed back inside. I lit the fire, made myself a quick meal, and settled in for the night. The cabin had a rustic charm, wooden beams on the ceiling, cozy furniture, and the soft glow of the fireplace. But as the hours passed, the silence began to weigh on me. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt unnatural, oppressive. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. The creaking started soon after, the sound of old wood settling, groaning under the weight of time. Nothing unusual, I reminded myself. Old places make noise. But this creaking was different. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like footsteps on the wooden floor above me. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The creaking continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other, like someone or something was walking around upstairs. But the cabin didn't have a second floor. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just the wind, or maybe some animal on the roof. Still, the noise persisted, growing louder, more pronounced. I tried to distract myself, turning on the small battery-operated radio I'd brought with me, but the static only made things worse. Every channel was filled with garbled noise, as if the very air around me was resisting communication. I turned it off, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Then came the whispers. At first I thought it was the wind, but as they grew louder, it became clear they weren't natural. They were soft, almost unintelligible, but unmistakably human. Words that I couldn't quite make out, like voices just beyond my hearing. I stood still, straining to listen, but every time I thought I could decipher the words, they faded, only to return moments later. I checked the windows, making sure they were all locked. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the wind or my tired mind playing games. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like they were coming from the walls, from within the cabin itself. I retreated to the living room, stoking the fire to bring some warmth into the space. The cabin had grown colder, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones no matter how close you sat to the flames. I wrapped myself in a blanket and stared at the fire, trying to calm my nerves. It was around midnight when the knock came, a soft, deliberate knock on the front door. My heart skipped a beat and I froze in place, listening. The knock came again, louder this time. Who would be knocking at this hour, out here in the middle of nowhere? Greg had mentioned there were no neighbors for miles. I stood up slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the kitchen knife I'd left on the counter. I walked to the door, pressed my ear against it, and listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the sound of my own breathing. I peeked through the peephole, expecting to see something, but there was no one there. The porch was empty, and the forest beyond was bathed in darkness. My gut told me not to open the door, but curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked it and pulled it open, the night air rushing in, cold and sharp. The porch was empty, no sign of anyone. But then I saw them, footprints, fresh, muddy footprints in the dirt leading up the steps. But they weren't normal footprints. They were large, distorted, as if they belonged to something. Wrong. The prints were too big to be human, with long, twisted toes that ended in claw-like impressions. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No rustling in the trees, no animals scurrying through the underbrush. Just those strange, twisted footprints leading up to the door, and then disappearing, as if whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. I slammed the door shut, bolting it and locking every window in the cabin. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the walls, angry, insistent. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in, the air thick with something unseen but unmistakably malevolent. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind felt like a threat. I sat in the corner of the living room, gripping the knife, my back to the wall as I waited for something, anything. But nothing came. The whispers continued, weaving in and out of the silence, growing louder and louder until they became a chorus of voices, all overlapping, all speaking words I couldn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as they began, they stopped. The cabin was silent once more, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that comes before something terrible happens, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your heart race. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every noise, every shadow felt like a threat. When dawn finally came, I didn't waste any time. I packed my things, grabbed my keys, and bolted out of the cabin without looking back. The silence followed me the entire way. My wife Emma and I had been planning this quiet weekend getaway for months. After a few exhausting years of work, bills and life getting in the way, we felt like we hadn't had any time for ourselves. So when we stumbled across a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods on a rental site, it seemed like a dream come true. The description was simple, a cozy one-bedroom retreat, no Wi-Fi, no distractions, just peace and quiet. It sounded perfect. A real chance to disconnect from the world and reconnect with each other. The drive up to the cabin was peaceful. The crisp autumn air and the changing leaves painted a picturesque scene along the winding mountain road. Emma kept commenting on how beautiful it was, her face lighting up at the sight of the dense forest surrounding the area. It felt like we were entering another world, far away from the noise of everyday life. As we pulled up to the cabin just before dusk, I had to admit it looked even better than the pictures. The old wooden structure sat nestled between towering pine trees, the fading sunlight casting a golden glow over the rustic stone chimney and the wooden porch out front. There was a small shed out back, the only other structure nearby. Otherwise, it was just us, the cabin, and miles of dense, untouched forest. Perfect. The first evening was uneventful, in the best possible way. We unpacked quickly and settled into the cozy little cabin. The interior was just as charming, warm, with wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and a soft, comfortable bed in the small bedroom. It wasn't much, but it felt like home. After a simple dinner, we curled up by the fire with a bottle of wine, letting the warmth and stillness wrap around us like a blanket. There were no cars, no sounds of civilization, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees outside. It was exactly what we needed. By 10 p.m., we were exhausted. We hadn't done much, but the quiet atmosphere and lack of distractions had a way of making us feel like we could finally relax. We turned off the lights, put out the fire, and crawled into bed. The bedroom was small but cozy, with a large window that faced the woods outside. The bed itself was comfortable, with thick wool blankets that kept out the growing chill of the night air. Emma fell asleep almost immediately. I lay awake for a while, listening to the soft sounds of the forest. There was something incredibly peaceful about being so far from everything. No buzzing electronics, no traffic, just the wind, the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere in the distance. I remember thinking that it felt like a perfect escape. Nothing could go wrong in a place like this, but sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up. It was sudden, like someone had shaken me from a deep sleep, though there was no sound, no obvious reason for my sudden alertness. The cabin was still. Emma was beside me, her breathing soft and even, completely undisturbed. I lay there for a moment, blinking in the dark, trying to figure out what had woken me. The fire had died hours ago, and the room was colder now, the temperature having dropped outside. I pulled the blankets up a little higher, thinking that maybe the chill had been what stirred me. That's when I heard it. A soft creak from the hallway just outside our bedroom. I froze, my body instantly on alert. I told myself it was just the house settling, that old cabins like this creaked and groaned all the time. But there was something deliberate about the sound, too rhythmic, too slow. Like footsteps, cautious footsteps, as if someone or something was trying to avoid detection. My heart began to race. I held my breath, straining to listen, hoping it was just my imagination. The creaking came again, closer this time. The sound was unmistakable now, heavy footsteps, soft but purposeful, moving down the hallway toward the bedroom. My mouth went dry, and every instinct in me screamed to wake Emma. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was frozen in place, fear rooting me to the bed. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I stared at the crack where the door hung slightly ajar, my eyes locked on the darkness beyond. I couldn't see anything, just the empty hallway, bathed in shadows, but I knew something was there, watching. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The house was silent again, the stillness so oppressive it felt like the walls were closing in on me. Then, just as I was starting to convince myself it was all in my head, the door creaked, slowly, painfully. It opened just a little more. I bit down hard on my lip, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would wake Emma. I wanted to move, to do something, but I was paralyzed by the fear of what might be on the other side of that door. I told myself it was just the wind. That's all. Maybe we hadn't latched the door properly, and a breeze had pushed it open. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was no wind. The night outside was still and calm. My pulse raced as I watched the door, waiting for something, anything to happen, but it didn't. The door remained partially open, revealing nothing but a strip of hallway and deep, impenetrable shadows. I lay there, listening for more sounds, but there was nothing, just the silence and the darkness. Minutes passed. The cold in the room seemed to deepen, biting into my skin despite the thick blankets. I felt a creeping sense of unease, as if the air itself had changed, thickened, become somehow wrong. Then the sound came again, not footsteps this time, but something else. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, a voice, low and garbled, like someone speaking just out of earshot. My chest tightened as I strained to make out the words, but they were too quiet, too distorted. The whispering stopped, and once again the house fell silent. I couldn't take it anymore. Slowly I turned toward Emma, careful not to make any noise. She was still asleep, her face peaceful in the dim light. I hesitated, not wanting to wake her, but the gnawing fear inside me wouldn't let me rest. I needed to know what was going on. I reached out and gently shook her shoulder. "Emma," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "What's wrong?" she asked groggily, her voice thick with sleep. I think someone's in the cabin," I whispered, my throat tight with fear. She blinked, confusion clouding her expression. "What? Are you sure?" "I heard footsteps," I said, my voice trembling. Right outside the door. Emma sat up slowly, her eyes wide now, the sleepiness replaced with concern. She listened for a moment, her body tense beside mine, but the house was silent once more. "I don't hear anything," she whispered after a few seconds. "I swear, Emma, I heard someone out there," I insisted. "And the door, it opened on its own." She frowned, glancing toward the bedroom door. It was still slightly ajar, just as I'd described. "Maybe it's just the wind," she said softly, but there was a hint of doubt in her voice. I shook my head. "It's not the wind. Something is in here." Emma hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, let's check it out." We both climbed out of bed, moving cautiously. The floor creaked beneath our feet as we approached the door, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking straight into danger. My pulse quickened as I pushed the door open fully, revealing the empty hallway beyond. The living room was just ahead, shrouded in darkness. I stepped into the hallway first, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Emma was right behind me, her hand on my arm as if to steady herself. We moved slowly, cautiously toward the living room. The house was deathly silent now, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards under our feet. When we reached the living room, I stopped. My heart nearly stopped. There in the corner by the window was a figure. Tall, thin, its back turned to us, standing completely still. My stomach dropped, and I instinctively stepped back, nearly knocking into Emma. She gasped, her grip tightening on my arm. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "But we need to get out of here." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if staring out the window, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. There was something unnaturally still about it, something that made my skin crawl. I took a step back, pulling Emma with me. We needed to leave, right now. My mind raced, trying to figure out the best way to escape without alerting whatever was in the room with us. But before we could move any further, the figure shifted. It turned its head slowly, as if sensing our presence. My heart leaped into my throat as the figure's face, or lack thereof, came into view. There were no eyes, no features, just darkness where its face should have been. The whispering started again, faint but unmistakable, like a voice carried on the wind. Then, the lights flickered, plunging the cabin into complete darkness. It all started with a search for a weekend getaway. After weeks of being chained to my desk, drowning in work, and buried under an avalanche of emails, meetings, and deadlines, I desperately needed a break. The constant noise and grind of city life were beginning to wear me down. I craved silence, solitude, and a chance to breathe. Just a few days to reset, away from the stress of the city. So, I did what most people do in my situation. I went online, started scrolling through listings, and found what seemed like the perfect place. I stumbled upon a small, secluded Airbnb cabin nestled deep in the mountains. It looked ideal. The photos showed a charming wooden structure surrounded by thick pine trees with a clear blue lake nearby. The description said it was perfect for those seeking peace and quiet, with no internet, no TV, just nature. The kind of isolation that seemed to be calling my name. It was a minimalist dream, a simple cabin with a few rooms, a fireplace, and enough space to unwind. The reviews were glowing too. Previous guests talked about how serene it was, how it gave them time to reconnect with themselves and escape the pressures of everyday life. But the price? That caught my attention. It was cheap, far too cheap for what was advertised. Cabins like this, with a view like that, usually came with a hefty price tag, especially on popular sites like Airbnb. Yet, this one was available for a fraction of what similar cabins were going for. I assumed it must have been a last-minute cancellation or a hidden gem the algorithm hadn't caught yet. Either way, I didn't think twice about it. I booked the cabin for the weekend, packed my bag, and hit the road that Friday afternoon. The drive out was pretty standard, mostly highways at first, followed by smaller roads winding through sleepy little towns. As I got closer to the mountains, though, the scenery changed. The sky grew darker, the air colder, and the road twisted into a narrow, winding path that seemed to snake deeper into the woods. The trees, tall and dense, formed a thick canopy over the road, blocking out most of the late afternoon sunlight. I remember thinking how peaceful it all seemed. Quiet, calm, exactly what I needed. And then, as I made the final turn onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, my GPS started acting strange. The signal flickered in and out, and eventually the screen froze entirely. At first I thought it was just a signal issue. Mountain roads often mess with GPS, especially in remote areas. I wasn't too worried though. I had printed directions as a backup. I pulled them out, glanced at the next few turns, and pressed on. The road quickly narrowed, turning from a rough dirt path into more of a trail than an actual road. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches scraping the sides of my car. Shadows lengthened as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting the forest in an eerie twilight glow. I didn't see any other cars or signs of life, but that didn't bother me. That was part of the appeal. I wanted to be alone, far away from anyone or anything. About 15 minutes later, I reached what was supposed to be the driveway of the cabin. My GPS, still frozen, indicated I had arrived at the destination. I pulled up, expecting to see the cozy little retreat from the photos, but what I found instead made my stomach drop. There was no cabin, no wooden structure, no idyllic getaway, just an empty clearing, surrounded by trees so thick they almost blocked out the remaining daylight. I got out of the car, my brow furrowed in confusion. This didn't make any sense. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal. The directions were clear though. This was the spot. I walked around the clearing trying to find any sign of a building or structure, but it was as if the cabin had never existed. The ground was covered in dirt and fallen leaves, and the trees stood like silent sentinels offering no clues. At first I thought I might have missed a turn somewhere, that maybe the cabin was just further down the path. So I got back in the car and drove a little farther. The road became even more narrow, more twisted, until it was barely a road at all. After about 20 minutes of driving with no sign of anything but more trees and rocks, I came to a dead end. The road simply stopped, swallowed up by the dense forest. That's when the unease started to settle in. I got out of the car again, looking around, but there was nothing. Just trees, the thick underbrush, and the distant sound of the wind rustling through the branches. The air was still, too still. No birds, no insects, just silence. I decided to head back to the clearing, thinking I'd retrace my steps, maybe try a different route. But as I drove, something strange happened. The road that had seemed so clear before now felt unfamiliar. I could have sworn I was driving the same way, but the turns seemed sharper, the path more treacherous. The trees seemed to close in even more, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms scraping against my car. Every mile felt longer, like I was driving in circles, trapped in a maze with no way out. Then the static started. At first it was faint, barely audible over the sound of the engine. But as I drove, it grew louder, filling the car with a low, eerie hiss. I turned off the radio, but the static persisted, like it was coming from the very air around me. I glanced at my phone, but it was still dead, no signal, no GPS. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a structure through the trees. Relief flooded through me. I'd found the cabin. But as I got closer, my relief turned to confusion, and then dread. It was the cabin from the listing. The same wooden walls, the same wraparound porch, even the ivy creeping up the sides. But it wasn't in the clearing where it was supposed to be. It was just sitting there, deep in the woods, surrounded by trees so thick it looked like it had been hidden for decades. I stopped the car and stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. This didn't make any sense. I had been driving for miles and the cabin was supposed to be back in the clearing. How did it get here? I was certain I hadn't passed it before. Against my better judgment, I got out of the car and approached the cabin. The air around it felt heavy, cold, like the temperature had dropped by several degrees. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it, the wood old and rotting. I reached for the door, my hand trembling slightly, and pushed it open. Inside, the cabin looked exactly like the photos, rustic furniture, a small fireplace, a cozy kitchen. But it didn't feel right. The air was stale, thick with the smell of damp wood and dust, like no one had set foot inside for years. A layer of dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. I stepped further into the cabin, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. It was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. I felt like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see, like the cabin had been abandoned long ago and forgotten by time. That's when I saw it, a small leather-bound journal sitting on the table near the fireplace. Its cover was worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up. Flipping through the first few pages, the entries were mundane, written by someone who had clearly rented the cabin before. They talked about the beauty of the surrounding woods, the peacefulness of the lake, and how it was the perfect place to disconnect from the world. But about halfway through, the handwriting changed. The words became frantic, scribbled across the pages in a messy, hurried scrawl. I'm not alone out here. There's something in the woods. I hear it at night, moving between the trees. It's watching me. I don't know what it is, but it knows I'm here. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it, closer, always closer. I'm leaving tomorrow. I have to get out before it finds me. My hands shook as I read the final entry, dated just a few days ago. It's outside the door. I can hear it breathing. It's waiting for me to open it. I don't know if I'll make it through the night. I dropped the journal on the table, my heart racing. What the hell was this? I backed away from the table, my eyes darting to the windows. The sun had almost set, casting long shadows across the room. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I felt like I was being watched. Then, from outside, I heard a noise, a faint rustling, like something moving through the trees. Slowly, deliberately, I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound grew louder, closer, footsteps. Something was out there, moving toward the cabin. I backed toward the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't see anything through the windows, but I could feel it. Something was out there, just beyond the trees, watching me. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I bolted for the door, ran to my car, and floored it back down the path. The road twisted and turned, the trees seeming to close in around me as I drove, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out, away from whatever was lurking in those woods. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. When I finally pulled over, my hands were trembling, and my heart was still racing. I looked back down the road, half expecting to see something chasing me, but there was nothing, just the empty road and the fading light of the day. I didn't go back for my things. I didn't care. I just wanted to forget that cabin, forget everything that happened out there. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. That faint rustling, like something moving between the trees, waiting, watching. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun and laughter, a much-needed escape from our hectic lives. My friends and I had rented a secluded Airbnb in the mountains, a charming little cabin with rustic charm and a breathtaking view. As we drove up the winding road, excitement bubbled in the car, our laughter mingling with the sound of the engine. "This place is going to be amazing," Sarah exclaimed, scrolling through pictures of the cabin on her phone. "Look at that view." "Yeah, and the hot tub. We're going to have the best time," Josh chimed in, practically bouncing in his seat. I grinned at them, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Something about the place felt off. Maybe it was the way the trees loomed over the road like sentinels, or how the sunlight seemed to vanish as we ascended higher into the mountains. When we finally arrived, the cabin looked picturesque, surrounded by towering pines and a blanket of colorful autumn leaves. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the rustic wooden structure. We unloaded the car and rushed inside, our voices echoing in the cozy space. "Wow, this is way better than I expected," Sarah said, stepping into the living room, her eyes wide with wonder. The interior was charming, with exposed beams, a stone fireplace, and large windows that showcased the stunning view of the mountains. We dropped our bags and explored, the excitement of the weekend pushing the uneasy feeling to the back of my mind. As evening approached, we gathered around the dining table, sharing stories and laughing over our dinner. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, but as the darkness fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. "Okay, who's up for a game?" Josh suggested, breaking the silence that had begun to creep in. "Let's play truth or dare," Sarah said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. The game started off lighthearted, filled with silly dares and laughter, but as the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted. It was my turn, and as I sat there contemplating my options, a cold breeze swept through the room, causing the candles to flicker. "Dare," I finally said, trying to shake off the chill. "Go upstairs and knock on the bathroom door 3 times, Josh dared, grinning. "Come on, that's stupid," I protested, but the challenge ignited a thrill within me. "Fine, I'll do it," I declared, standing up. As I ascended the creaky stairs, I felt a mix of excitement and dread. The upper floor felt different, colder, as if the air was thick with an unseen weight. I approached the bathroom door, my heart racing, and knocked 3 times. Nothing. I turned to leave, but before I could, I heard a whisper behind me. It was soft and melodic, almost like a song carried on the wind. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. "Is anyone there?" I called out, but the only answer was silence. "Just my imagination," I muttered, trying to convince myself. When I returned to my friends, their faces were lit with curiosity. "What happened?" Sarah asked, leaning in closer. "Nothing. Just a weird vibe." I shrugged, hoping to brush off my unease. We continued playing, but I noticed the atmosphere had changed. The laughter felt strained, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer in the dim light. It wasn't long before Josh's turn came around again. "Okay, dare me to do something crazy," he said, his eyes gleaming. "Go outside and stand under the trees for 1 minute," Sarah challenged, a wicked grin on her face. "Easy." Josh laughed, heading for the door. We watched as he stepped into the night, the darkness swallowing him whole. Seconds turned into a minute, and unease began to settle in. "Shouldn't he be back by now?" I asked, glancing at my watch. "Maybe he's just messing with us," Sarah said, but her voice was laced with worry. Just then, the temperature in the room dropped, and the wind howled outside. I could see my breath fogging in the air. "I'm going to check on him," I said, my heart racing. As I stepped outside, the darkness enveloped me, the trees looming like twisted giants. I called out for Josh, but the only response was the eerie rustle of leaves. I squinted into the darkness, trying to find him, when suddenly I heard his voice, a low murmur, almost a chant, coming from the shadows. "Josh?" I called, my voice trembling. I moved toward the sound, but it faded as quickly as it had come. Panic set in, and I turned to rush back to the cabin when I felt a cold hand graze my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. "This isn't funny," I yelled, sprinting back inside. My friends were waiting by the door, their faces pale. "Where's Josh?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't find him," I stammered, heart racing. "But I heard him. He was chanting." "What?" Sarah gasped, looking terrified. Before I could respond, the lights flickered and the temperature dropped again. We huddled together, fear pooling in our stomachs. Just then, the door swung open, and Josh stumbled in, looking disheveled and pale. "What's going on?" he asked, breathless. "Where were you?" I exclaimed, relief flooding over me. "I don't know. I was just standing there, and then everything went dark," he replied, his eyes wide. I heard whispers. It felt like someone was trying to pull me away. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, panic rising in her voice. "I don't know. It was just this voice, calling my name. It felt so real," he said, shivering. We all exchanged nervous glances, the fear coiling tighter around us. "Let's just stay together," I suggested, trying to sound brave. We returned to the living room, the atmosphere heavy with dread. "Maybe we should turn in early," I said, glancing at the clock. It was already past midnight. "Agreed," Sarah said, her voice shaky. We all retreated to our separate rooms, but sleep was elusive. I lay in bed, heart pounding as I replayed the night's events in my mind. The whispers, the cold. Something was wrong. Hours passed, and just as I began to drift off, I was jolted awake by the sound of someone screaming. "Guys!" I shouted, bolting out of bed. I rushed down the hall, my heart racing. I burst into Josh's room and he was sitting up, eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" I asked, breathless. I don't know. I was just dreaming, but it felt so real," he gasped, his voice trembling. "Dreaming about what?" "I don't know. Just a voice, and it kept saying my name, over and over," he replied, shaking his head. I could feel the fear wrapping around us like a thick fog. "We need to get out of here," I said, glancing out the window. But before we could make a plan, a loud bang echoed from the living room, causing us both to jump. "What was that?" Josh asked, eyes wide. "I don't know, but we need to check it out," I said, grabbing a flashlight. We crept down the dark hallway, the shadows shifting ominously around us. The living room was eerily quiet, but I could feel something was off. I flicked on the flashlight, illuminating the room. The furniture was in disarray, as if something had been thrown around. The front door stood wide open, swinging slightly in the night breeze. "Guys!" Sarah's voice came from the kitchen, shaky and terrified. We rushed to her side as she pointed to the table. "Look." On the table lay a series of photographs, all of us, but they were old and faded. In each picture, someone else stood with us, an unfamiliar figure standing in the background, staring at the camera with hollow eyes. "What the hell?" I breathed, picking up a photo. Suddenly, the whispers returned, swirling around us, echoing in our ears. "Get out. Leave before it's too late." Panic surged through us as we stumbled back, the realization of our predicament settling in. "We need to leave now," I said, my voice rising. As we moved toward the door, it slammed shut in front of us, trapping us inside. "What the hell?" Josh shouted, pushing against it. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an oppressive presence. "You can't leave. You belong to us now." My heart raced as I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. "We need to find another way out," I yelled, looking around frantically. Just then, a shadow flickered across the wall, and I turned to see the figure from the photograph standing in the doorway to the kitchen, eyes dark and hollow. "Get away!" Sarah screamed, stumbling back. The figure stepped closer, its presence cold and suffocating. "You're not welcome here," it hissed, voice echoing with malice. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it at the figure, but it passed right through as if it were smoke. The figure only laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Foolish mortals, you cannot escape what you cannot see." I felt a surge of panic. "We need to find a window," I shouted, darting toward the back of the cabin. Josh and Sarah followed, but as we approached the glass door, the shadows twisted, forming a barrier. The whispers intensified, filling my head with dread. "Leave this place. Leave before it's too late." With all my strength, I threw myself against the door, but it wouldn't budge. "It's no use," I cried, tears stinging my eyes. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The whispers faded, leaving an eerie silence that pressed against us. "Where are you?" Josh's voice trembled in the dark. "I don't know, just hold on to each other," I yelled, trying to keep my fear in check. Then the figure appeared again, its form shifting and swirling in the darkness. "You cannot escape your fate," it whispered, and I felt a cold breeze brush past me. I turned to my friends, fear etching deep lines on their faces. We have to find another way. In the dim light of the moon filtering through the windows, I spotted a small window in the kitchen. "There!" I shouted, running toward it. We rushed to the window, and I pushed against it, the glass creaking ominously. "Help me!" I shouted, my heart racing. Together we heaved against it until finally the window gave way with a shattering sound. We scrambled through the opening, gasping for fresh air as we landed outside on the ground. "We did it!" Sarah cried, relief flooding her voice. But as we looked back at the cabin, the figure stood at the window, staring down at us with those hollow eyes. "You can't escape," it whispered, the sound echoing in the night. We ran, our footsteps pounding against the ground as we raced toward the road. The whispers faded behind us, but I knew deep down that they would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for us to return. Epilogue. Back in the city, we tried to put the experience behind us. The trip was supposed to be a break from our lives, but it left us with something darker, a haunting memory that never faded. A month later, we received an email from the Airbnb host. "I noticed you didn't leave a review. I hope you enjoyed your stay. The cabin has a history of being haunted. Just wanted to let you know." My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I glanced outside, the night dark and foreboding. Some places were better left undisturbed.